Who could have predicted a morning in late 2025 where the rhythmic industrial heartbeat of the North American continent simply stopped? For the first time in more than a century, since the golden spikes were driven into the wilderness, the two titans of northern transport, Canadian Pacific and Canadian National, ceased operations simultaneously. It wasn't a freak accident, it wasn't a natural disaster, it was a calculated, synchronized pause. But as the engines cooled, a much larger story began to emerge from the silence. Breaking tonight, Ottawa has just executed a maneuver that fundamentally rewires the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. While Washington was distracted by the theater of toughness, assuming it held all the cards in a regional trade war, Canada committed $500 million to a project that renders American leverage obsolete. This isn't just about steel and rail, it's about the surgical removal of a century-old dependency. On March 20th, as the White House prepared a new round of aggressive trade measures, Canada quietly launched a strategic corridor designed to bypass United States ports entirely. No grand speeches, no diplomatic fireworks, just a $500 million decision that effectively stripped the United States of its role as the continent's gatekeeper. For decades, American hegemony over Canada rested on a single, unshakable geographic truth. If you control the ports, the inspection stations, and the transit routes, you control the wealth of the North. This was the silent foundation of U.S. power. Canadian grain from the prairies, oil from Alberta, and minerals from the Canadian Shield had to flow south. They had to touch American infrastructure, pass through American bottlenecks like the Port of Houston or the rail yards of Chicago, and subject themselves to the volatility of American domestic politics. This geographic reality allowed Washington to apply crushing economic pressure without ever firing a shot. A simple work-to-rule inspection at the border or a targeted tariff at a Gulf port was enough to bring Canadian exporters to their knees. It was a relationship based on permission. But while the Trump administration focused on the optics of punishment, viewing Canada as a captive market with nowhere else to go, Ottawa was methodically engineering an escape. They realized that the only way to win a game of leverage is to stop playing it. By expanding a sovereign land bridge to the south, they have created a reality where the United States is no longer a necessary partner, but merely a transit zone. The centerpiece of this liberation strategy is the expansion of the Canadian Pacific Kansas City CPKC network. This isn't just another railway line, it is a 32,000-kilometer steel spine that represents the first and only single-line rail network connecting Canada, the United States, and Mexico. By investing $500 million into the capacity and efficiency of this corridor, Canada has transformed a logistical asset into a geopolitical weapon. Consider the mechanics of this bypass. In the old model, Canadian grain bound for global markets often had to be offloaded at U.S. ports, generating billions in fees for American terminal operators and supporting thousands of American jobs in logistics and maritime services. Now, a grain hopper loaded in Manitoba or Saskatchewan stays on the same track under the management of a single company, rolling directly into the heart of Mexico. It never touches a U.S. port. It never requires a U.S. maritime inspector. It is never subjected to the sudden security delays or tariff adjustments that have become the hallmark of recent American trade policy. The $500 million investment wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a massive infusion of industrial hardware. We are talking about the procurement of thousands of high-capacity specialized hopper cars designed for maximum efficiency. We are talking about a new fleet of Tier 4 locomotives, the most powerful and environmentally compliant engines in the world, capable of hauling massive tonnages across the Continental Divide. This is infrastructure built for a 40-year horizon, not a 4-year election cycle. Canada didn't just buy trains, they bought a permanent alternative to the American coastal monopoly. The shockwaves of this project are already hitting the balance sheets of American port cities. For a generation, cities like Seattle, Portland, and New Orleans functioned as the toll collectors for Canadian prosperity. Every ton of Canadian wheat or potash that passed through an American terminal contributed to the local tax base, funded longshoremen pensions, and supported a massive ecosystem of tugboat operators, warehouse managers, and customs brokers. With the activation of the CPKC bypass, A massive share of that revenue is simply evaporating. Because of international transit laws, these trains cross U.S. territory like innocent passage through international waters. They are legal, protected, and effectively untouchable. The U.S. government cannot tariff goods that are merely transiting its soil to a third-party destination. They cannot slow them down without violating ironclad North American rail treaties. While Washington assumed Canada was a junior partner that needed American goodwill to survive, Canadian exporters found a massive, hungry market to the south that was eager to bypass the middleman. Mexico is the critical piece of this puzzle. With a population of 130 million and an industrial sector that is rapidly integrating with global supply chains, Mexico isn't just an alternative for Canada, it is a replacement for the uncertainty of the U.S. market. This move by Ottawa was not an emotional reaction. It was a cold, clinical response to a pattern of unpredictability. For years, Canadian leaders watched as trade agreements like the USMCA were questioned, and as allies were treated with the same hostility as adversaries. For a grain farmer in Alberta, or a logistics CEO in Montreal, this environment made long-term planning impossible. You cannot invest billions in a 10-year project if your primary trade route can be closed by a midnight social media post. So, Canada built predictability into the earth itself. They laid steel and poured concrete. They realized that while speeches and policy papers can be retracted, a locomotive has a service life of 30 years. A rail corridor, once established, creates its own gravity. Once Mexican flour mills and industrial plants establish a direct, reliable link with Canadian suppliers, those relationships become structural. Trust, the most valuable currency in global trade, has been transferred from the U.S.-Canada relationship to the Canada-Mexico corridor. The American strategy of maximum pressure relied on the belief that geography had trapped Canada in a cage. But as the first full-length grain trains began arriving in Mexico City, that cage was revealed to be an illusion. The leverage didn't just weaken, it vanished. When you have a direct line to a 130 million person market that doesn't require permission from the gatekeeper's threats start to sound like background noise. There is a realization dawning in Washington that few are willing to voice. This model is a blueprint for the future. If Canada can successfully reroute its agricultural heartland to bypass U.S. ports, what stops them from doing the same with energy? What stops them from integrating their manufacturing sector directly with the Bajío region of Mexico, leaving American Rust Belt suppliers in the rearview mirror? Infrastructure is the ultimate form of sovereign policy. In the 21st century, power isn't just about who has the largest military, it's about who controls the flow of atoms, the food, the fuel, and the raw materials that keep civilization running. Every time Canada invests in an alternative route, every time they diversify their reach, American influence shrinks. The Trump administration didn't lose its grip on Canadian trade in a high-stakes negotiation or at a G7 summit. It lost it in the procurement offices of rail companies and in the long-term planning documents of the Canadian Ministry of Transport. While the U.S. was playing a game of short-term political wins, Canada was playing a game of generational logistics. They didn't fight the gatekeeper, they simply built a new world where the gate no longer exists. As of tonight, the shift is no longer theoretical. The trains are moving. The contracts between Canadian cooperatives and Mexican buyers have been signed in ink that will last for decades. The markets have moved, and the leverage that Washington once believed was a permanent fact of nature has slipped through its fingers. This transformation was quiet. It wasn't designed to make headlines, but to make history. It sends a definitive message to the global community. The era where North American trade was a monologue directed by the United States is over. By investing in its own independence, Canada has proven that no wall is high enough to stop a nation determined to find its own way. The final question isn't whether the United States will try to react or retaliate. The question is much more sobering. When Washington finally realizes that the future of the continent's trade has already moved elsewhere, what will it do to convince its neighbors that it is still a partner worth having? The tracks are laid, the engines are humming, and for the first time in a century, the trains are running on a schedule that Washington no longer controls. Canada didn't just outgrow the United States, It outthought it, and the world is watching.